bourgeoisie produces, above all, art zone. Gravediggers.
Hey folks, welcome to your weekly episode of Das Criminal. It's Amr, and I'm coming to you from a very rainy and very chilly Toronto.
And it's Elizabeth Holmes in San Francisco.
Yeah, we have a great guest on today. The one and only, the queen of all grifts.
Yeah, it's Erin from Seoul, which was also rainy today.
Yeah, we have similar weather, which kind of connects us in a sort of adorable way.
So, welcome to another episode, guys. We've got a fun one today.
Yeah, we've had a bunch of very depressing episodes lately. So this one is a hilarious one. There's absolutely no one you can empathize with here. Just genuinely a bunch of miserable people grifting each other. So, pour yourself a drink, get a snack. But also be careful because you're going to laugh a lot, so you might choke, so careful.
We do have just a couple general Das Criminal updates.
Yeah, so Radio Warner has put up the third episode that I've done with them in a series on the rise of the Islamic Empire. So check them out. They're really good people over there. They're really worth listening to.
Yeah, and don't forget, please, to subscribe and rate our podcast because it really helps us out.
Yeah. So, without further ado, you want to get into it?
Yeah, let's do it.
Henry Kissinger, George Schultz, James Mattis, William Perry, David Boies. What do these men have in common besides, being war criminals or attorneys representing war criminals? Well, they've all invested millions of dollars in a Silicon Valley startup called Theranos. Unfortunately for them, the company, once worth $9 billion, dissolved in 2018 amid investigations of fraud. Company founder Elizabeth Holmes is set to face trial 2021 for her role in this fraud. But who is Elizabeth Holmes, and how did a 19-year-old Stanford dropout become the face of Silicon Valley grift? Elizabeth Holmes was born on February 3, 1984, to Christian Rasmus Holmes IV, a vice president at Enron who ended up holding positions in federal government after the collapse of Enron, and mother Noel Ann Holmes, a congressional staffer. Her dad's name is all you need to know about her class position. Anyone who has the fourth after his name pretty much is worth at least $1 million. I do not want to name my son after me, and so on and so forth. It's pretentious as hell. But yeah, also she has, grifting is in her DNA. If anyone has heard about Enron, she was set up to be a grifter. During her childhood, Elizabeth Holmes, as she constantly reminds us in her TED Talks, she loses her uncle to skin cancer, and apparently that inspires her to invent the medical technology for early diagnoses. In 2002, she attends Stanford University for chemical engineering. But in 2004, when she was a sophomore, she drops out at 19 years old and uses her tuition savings, and I put savings in quotation marks because, again, going back to her family's background, I'm pretty sure they were loaded. So it's not like, she was putting pennies in a piggy bank for her university. But she uses her savings to start a company called Real-Time Cures, which is later renamed to Theranos, which is supposedly a combination of therapy and diagnostics. And I really fucking hate this Silicon Valley trend of really insipid names.
My younger brother will not purchase from something with a pun. He will not eat at a restaurant with a pun and things like that. He hates them. If he sees something like that, it ruins his day.
That's someone I respect. If your younger brother is listening right now, I respect that. I salute you, sir. Yeah, I don't know. With Silicon Valley, it's either puns or words that have all the vowels removed. They just remove all the vowels and it's just a series of consonants that you're supposed to guess what the word is, and it's fucking awful.
Yeah, or a random Latin word that means darkness.
Yeah, fucking at the end of this episode, I'm gonna get back to this, but as far as I'm concerned, we should just put a wall up around Silicon Valley and just remove it from the planet. So Holmes takes up her money and she starts Theranos. And initially, she wants to invent a lab on a chip device, which are, common devices. I mean, I worked on one during my undergrad dissertation. But her device is supposed to be a chip that you can place on a patient's skin. And the idea is that it will have a series of microneedles going into the patient's skin and into their veins or capillaries, and it would detect infections and then inject varying proportions of antibiotics according to the infection, which is medically impossible. Not it's impossible to fly when you say that to the Wright brothers or whatever. It's medically impossible. The whole point of antibiotics is, you need a specific antibiotic for a specific infection, and the reason that antibiotics are potent is they're in a bag and they need to be, in a certain temperature until they're being used. They can't just be waved around on a fucking chip.
I have a medical implant in my body that releases medicine slowly. And basically, it just releases a little bit more at the start and then sort of slows down as it runs out. And then eventually I have to get it replaced. So I'm on my second one. So this doesn't make sense because this is in my body and it's bigger than a patch.
Yeah, and this is a specific medication for a specific thing. She's thinking, I'm going to put all the world's known antibiotics on one chip, and whatever the infection is, the chip will decide what antibiotic to dispense, which is deranged.
Yeah, high hopes for this one.
Yeah, but anyways, somehow she realizes that's not possible and develops a new idea, or comes up with a new idea, which is a blood testing device that can test small samples taken from basically thumb pricks for a variety of conditions, levels, diseases, things, whatever. But the idea is that you take some blood, there's the device that pricks your thumb, and it will fill up a vial called a nanotainer. Again, fucking hate these words. And it's 1.87 centimeters in height. And it fills it up with blood, a tiny amount of blood. And the idea is that these vials will then be put in a cartridge, and the cartridge is inserted into what she called the Edison, which is a printer-sized box that is supposed to use various machines inside that box to test this tiny, tiny, tiny amount of blood for over 200 plus analytes, 200 plus conditions, tests, and so on. And it came because, Holmes kept talking about her phobia of needles and not liking to be injected.
Holmes's professors at Stanford allegedly told her early on that such devices were conceptually interesting, but just not medically possible. When you have blood drawn for analysis, they don't take several vials just for fun. Different tests require things like heating up the blood or blasting a light through it, and this degrades the sample. You can't run 200 tests from a tiny, tiny bit of blood. It's just not possible with the technology we have.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, she kept insisting, which I found hilarious, because she doesn't have any background in chemistry. She had 1 year of chemical engineering in university, which is not the same as chemistry or biochemistry. Like you said, they don't just take extra vials, we're going to take one more vial just to make a margarita in the background or whatever. No, they take those vials because if you do one test, then that sample is no longer viable for another test. It's like a fork in the road. You do A, therefore B is impossible. You do C, therefore D is impossible. So you take all these samples to do all these different tests so you could cover your bases.
I feel like we should probably note, too, for our listeners who don't know, Amr has a degree in chemistry. A finished degree in chemistry.
Yes, I did a double major in chemistry and neuroscience. And the fact that I'm sitting here, I mean, I'm relatively comfortable. I'm not complaining, but I'm also not worth $400 million. So the fact that this idiot is managed to, be on Forbes is, frustrating to me. Really annoying.
Amr, you really missed out.
No, honestly, I was researching for this episode and I kept thinking to myself, what am I doing? I can just go to Silicon Valley and lie to a bunch of investors and be like, yeah, so we do this chemistry and this chemical reaction and, we can cure HIV or something, make people fly, literally just levitate or whatever. Fucking hell. Yeah, I mean, look, in 2010, without any prototypes or anything, by 2010 she has raised $92 million in venture capital. That is 92 million with an M. And she uses that money to build a lab and a headquarters and a villain's lair, if you want to call it that, in the valley with around 700 plus employees. By 2010, at the end of 2010, 2011, she's running out of money, so she gets a 12 billion credit guaranteed by her then boyfriend, the 40-year-old Sunny Balwani. And this is an interesting tangent because this is just bizarre. So Holmes met Balwani in China during a Mandarin course she was taking before her freshman year at Stanford. And she was 18, and at the time he was married and he was 38. And allegedly, she was being bullied by her cohort there. And he was the only one who befriended her. This is actually, I was dying when I was reading this. And, they started out as friends because he was the only one willing to befriend her. And they ended up starting dating in 2003 when she dropped out of Stanford. And he divorced his wife to date her. He also then, by 2009, so from 2003, he was giving her informal advice about running this company. But in 2009, 2010, when he dropped his credit, like when he guaranteed this credit, he used the credit to become chief operating officer and president of Theranos, where Holmes became the CEO and chairwoman.
My 38M girlfriend, 18F, wants $12 million for her blood machine that doesn't work. Is this a red flag?
Oh man, it's fucking, yeah, I can see that being posted.
In all honesty, though, I don't see how Balvani's involvement wasn't a deterrent for investors rather than a beacon of interest because, my seed money came from my middle-aged boyfriend whom I met when I was 18. That doesn't sound like a great start to me. I think they kept their romantic relationship a secret, but still.
Yeah, apparently they did, based on the research that I did, but it was everyone at Theranos knew because they never disclosed it to investors or to anyone, but they'd arrive at Theranos every day at the same time and they'd take the same plane to go places and they would take the same car to go back home, and everyone knew she was living with him in a condo in Palo Alto.
Oh, they live together? Fuck.
Yeah. And she never said it, but oh yeah, they're not just roommates, they're living together. What a fucking idiot. In 2011, by happy chance, she meets former Secretary of State George Schultz, who worked as Secretary of the Treasury under Nixon and State under Reagan. And she convinces him to invest in this startup of hers. And he invests and also becomes a member of the board. And through his connections as a political person, he adds legitimacy to her company as well as bringing aboard further big names to the board, like Henry Kissinger, James Mattis, William Perry, and the DeVos family.
Normally, I would say people this rich sometimes don't even know what they invest in. They might have money in lots of different ventures to see what sticks. But if they're on the board, it means they were specifically involved in bringing Theranos to the market.
Yeah, I wonder what they were thinking in board meetings, But then again, that's the problem, right? Because none of them have any chemistry or biochemistry background, and they're just a bunch of, politicians and military freaks. And for them, the board meetings are just, when are we going to get our money? How much is this worth? They have they don't have the background to ask questions like, is this physically possible? How are you making this possible?
There's also a lot to be said about Holmes's persona. So she wears these black turtlenecks. She speaks in a very low voice, which people have said is not her real voice. She purposefully lowers her voice and speaks slowly because apparently that's supposed to draw people in. I don't know. To me, it sounds absolutely sociopathic, but perhaps a lot went into this persona to seem legitimate and fool people. But then there's also this question of how much of that is just being a white woman from an upper class family who did a year at Stanford.
Yeah, it's a self-affirming cycle where the more legitimacy she gets, the more people are if Henry Kissinger believes her, surely she must have something.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also you were right in the sense that I mean, it must be exhausting to fake that voice all the time. But also, like, apparently, one of the interviews from like with one of her former employees who was interviewed by her to work at her company was like, yeah, she never blinked once. So make of that what you will. But my theory is, reptile people.
She has these big blue round eyes, and I think some of it is how she does her makeup, but she looks like Lady Gaga in the Bad Romance video.
That is the most accurate description I could think of. Yeah. Yeah, it is disturbing. And yeah, she says that she wears like her outfits. She thinks she idolizes Steve Jobs, which again makes sense because Steve Jobs' rise to fame was yelling at a bunch of engineers being like, I want my everything on my Walkman to be on my phone. Do it now.
I will say I own a black turtleneck, and it is very flattering. Maybe more people should try the black turtleneck.
No, I've seen you in the black turtle. It really works on you. I do recommend it on you.
Thanks, Summer.
You're not like, talking in a deep voice and, your eyes are bulging out of your head.
Anyway, guys, please buy my medical patch. It treats you for corona. It injects bleach.
Yeah, it protects you against, curses, omens, vampires, etc., etc.
You can't wear it if you're a Gemini sun, though. It won't work.
Yeah, and I'm sure everyone on that board would believe you, because they're all imbeciles. In 2013, Holmes finally issues a press release and starts up a website for Theranos. And the same year, she signs a deal with Walgreens, where she's supposed to supply them with like 40 Theranos wellness centers. And they're primarily in Arizona, but also in California. And the idea is, you go into these wellness centers, you ask to be tested for something or another. They test you right there and then, and within half an hour, you get your results and everyone's happy.
I would just like to point out, anytime you see the word wellness, red flag, red flag, red flag. Because wellness isn't necessarily about science, about medicine. It's about making you feel better.
Yeah, it's like vague, like, detoxify, wellness. It's fuck it. It's a scam. The word wellness is like a red flag.
Right. You don't have to have any degree or something like that to open a wellness center. You have to be a doctor to run a medicine practice.
Yeah. If someone is opening a clinic, they have to get they have to be an MD, and they get regulated by things like the FDA and, CMS and all these places. If you're opening a wellness center, you could just sell literal snake oil and there's no, legal ramifications for that. But there's a tiny little snag here, an issue, a little obstacle. The technology wasn't working at all. First of all, the tests are inaccurate. They take a long time. They can't test for everything. Just, disaster. So the workaround for Theranos was they'll receive your samples from the wellness centers, and literally, whatever wellness center you're in Arizona, they'll mail the samples to Theranos, and they'll test them on third-party mass market, devices that are already being used, like the Siemens AG devices, which are the size of a room. Well, not that big, but larger devices that are already in the market, and they'll test your samples on them to determine the results, except because they're taking the samples from your thumb and it's so little blood, they're forced to dilute the samples with water or other solution. And to meet because the Siemens AG devices require a certain amount of blood in the vial device to be tested. Anything less than that, the machine doesn't recognize anything. But if you dilute the blood with solution or water, then you're also adding so much, you're diluting the sample so much that the machine can't detect the analyte. It's just noise. It's just random noise at this point. So medically, if you have a condition, it's really, really bad. I read in one article that the Edison machines that Theranos was supposed to work on, they were so bad that for a simple potassium test, right, the most simple of tests, potassium test, 45% of the test results were only possible if the patient was dead when they gave the blood.
Oh, geez. That's like submitting a tiny vial of Cabernet Sauvignon and then being like, maybe an alcohol problem?
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah, it's like if you get the results, you just look at the person and you're like, are you dead? Can I feel your pulse? Are you a vampire? Yeah, it's a disaster. Also, the whole point of Theranos initially was, we'll avoid the whole sticking you with needles part because, you don't like needles, whatever, that's fine. I don't particularly care for needles either. But the whole selling point was that you just get a little prick on your thumb and that's it. But because they were using the Siemens AG machines and other devices to actually test the samples, they literally began asking people at Walgreens to do the forearm intravenous blood test samples instead of capillaries on your thumb. So even that wasn't working. They had to take blood from you anyways, like large amounts of blood. And, when confronted, Holmes and her PR team were like, because of the test you specifically requested, your doctor has asked for more blood or whatever. It's very vague, very avoiding the issue.
Yeah.
In 2014, 2015, Theranos basically skyrocketed in popularity. Holmes ends up having her profile done in Forbes, Fortune, and a bunch of these magazines you see in grocery stores and gas stations and so on. In 2015, she's reached a point where even Joe Biden, then vice president, now presidential nominee, visits and, he's given a tour of the fake lab. I mean, I say fake lab because Holmes didn't want him being shown how nothing is working. So they set, they made a prop set of, a fake lab that she just toured around with him.
This fake lab went pretty deep, by the way. So they would draw your blood, draw a little thumb prick, and then Theranos employees would run that to Quest Diagnostics, like a real lab for testing. And then at the end of your tour would return and be like, here's your results.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I read at one point, when investors came to look around, they basically okay, we'll take your blood. And then they took the investors out for lunch while the employees were rushing around trying to get the results from the Quest Diagnostics machines. Which, to be fair, free lunch, I'll do it. Fuck it. You get a little salad, some pasta. Why not?
Yeah.
So at this point, because, she's getting all this popularity, more investments start flooding in. And at this point, Theranos ends up being worth, the company's worth $9 billion. And Holmes herself, through her shares and her personal value, is worth $400 million. And she controls Theranos. There's no IPO. There's no, shareholders. It's a private company and she's the controlling person.
It's absolutely bizarre to me that a human being can be worth $400 million. Or on the other hand, worth a negative amount of money if they are in debt.
Yeah, it's the perfect evidence on how the economy just doesn't mean anything. And I don't mean it in a sort of edgy way. I just mean it after Nixon depegged the dollar from the gold standard, money just became a floating idea, right? We agree that a dollar is worth a dollar because we all agree a dollar is worth a dollar. But the idea that, a dollar is worth some amount in gold in Fort Knox that you can take is no longer valid. So I could say that Aaron is worth $500 million. And if enough people agree with me, then Aaron is worth $500 million.
I don't really have any assets. I rent my apartment that I live in. I don't drive a car here, nothing like that. I think I'm worth literally nothing.
Yes, but your friendship to me is priceless.
Oh, that's so sweet.
Yeah, just a little, wholesomeness in this podcast.
I feel the same about you.
Oh, thank you. In 2015, Holmes successfully lobbies the state of Arizona to abolish a law that had previously required that if you needed blood testing, then the blood test can only be conducted following a medical doctor's orders. And so now patients can request blood tests at will. And, these Theranos wellness centers, they basically offer patients tests a la carte, like a little menu. Like if you've ever been to a restaurant that's all you can eat sushi, and they have a menu of various items you can order, the Theranos wellness centers are the exact same. You pick a bunch of tests and you're like, I'd like this, this, and this, and you pay and, they do the test. And the patients interviewed during the sporting and the documentaries and all that, they claim that they like Theranos because apparently it wasn't as expensive as other options. So their problem didn't seem to be as much fear of needles as cost.
Okay, I actually have some ambivalence about this because in the United States, where healthcare costs are so high, being able to have blood tests without a doctor's approval also saves people money because you don't have to pay for the doctor's fee to get that prescription. I can't count how many times I've been sick with something very obvious like strep throat, and I had to pay high fees for a doctor to tell me what I already knew so that I could get an antibiotic prescription. I don't think that antibiotics should be handed out so willy-nilly, especially with the rise of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. But I also understand how requiring prescriptions for certain things disproportionately affects poor people and those without access to this kind of healthcare.
Yeah, exactly. No, I completely agree with you. But the way I see it, and again, this is coming from a person living in Canada, is that this is an issue of access and of availability, not of needles and fear of needles and so on, which does exist and that's fair. But like for me, and I have certain medical issues right now, but whenever I need, right, my doctor puts an order for a blood test and I go to the clinic or the lab or whatever, and I show them the order, and they do the blood test, and I go home, and that's it. And the doctor gets the results directly to her. It's just interesting because, first of all, it's free, right? That's the whole point. It's universal healthcare. Well, it's single payer, which is different from universal, but, I don't want to get into the weeds with that. But if the issue is cost, then single payer healthcare solves that because here, all you do is, the doctor asks for, requests a test and it's done and it's free. It also inculcates trust because I don't have to worry about, is the doctor doing this just to make money or because she's actually concerned about me? Or is the lab just doing this to make money? I'm not second guessing their intentions. I know they have my best interest at heart because it doesn't have anything to do with money. Just everything is, covered by the government. So in that sense, it's a lot more effective to just, lobby for universal healthcare than to do Theranos.
No, totally. And I think you should be able to go into any lab. Well, I think healthcare should be free and everyone should be covered, but I think you should be able to go into any lab and get tested for things like HIV.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I agree with that. And here you just go to a clinic and you ask to be tested and that's fine. But I also with some of these tests that Theranos was running, you need to be an MD to read what's going on, right? Like, I can't just go into the lab and be like, I'd like to be tested for my cytolites, my immunoglobulin, whatever. And it's like, okay, but these results need to be taken in context. And the only people with context are people who know your medical history.
Right, yeah.
But anyways, in July in 2015, the FDA approves of an old and rarely used herpes test to be done by Theranos. So at this point, they haven't had FDA approval for anything, and they don't have to because, again, they're advertised as a wellness center, not as a lab. But because they start positioning themselves as a lab, an actual lab, they need FDA approval, and the FDA gives them approval for exactly one test to be done from the advertised 200, and it's an old herpes test. And they end up doing a celebration in headquarters with I hate Silicon Valley so much. They have fucking trampolines and a fucking bouncy castle and all those fucking horrid stuff.
They had a herpes party.
Pretty much, yeah. I don't begrudge the employees too much. It's more the top command that I'm complaining about. The higher you climb, the bigger the fall, as the saying goes. So in October of 2015, John Carreiro of the Wall Street Journal, who is a very good journalist, by the way, I do recommend him. He publishes an expose showing that Theranos was A, not using its devices for tests, B, when it does use its devices, the results are completely bunk, and C, the conditions there are awful, where Sunny Balwani is basically spying on everyone. Everyone has their keys, the laptop keystrokes are logged. Emails are being tracked. There is just a culture of fear and secrecy, and Sunny and Elizabeth are just bullying everyone. And before he publishes this, Carreiro does what any good journalist does, which is he reaches out to Elizabeth Holmes for comment, her side of the story, a sort of interview. And she arrives at the Wall Street Journal flanked by a phalanx of lawyers led by David Boies. And Boies, for all those of you who don't know, he represented the US government against Microsoft in the 90s. He represented Harvey Weinstein when he was smearing all of his victims. Just a swell guy, people's hero,
Ugh.
Yeah, and one of the investors in Holmes' Theranos was one Rupert Murdoch, whose $125 million investment made him the highest investor in Theranos. And he also owns the Wall Street Journal among his media empire. So Holmes did the equivalent of, when a kid goes to their mom and they're like, the neighbor kid bullied me or whatever. And she's like, calls Rupert Murdoch to try and quash the story from being published. And Murdoch basically tells her, no, I trust my journalists. If they want to publish this, they should publish this. Which is like, even if Murdoch says that, that says a lot about you.
That's a pleasant surprise.
Yeah, broken clocks and all that. So Theranos begins harassing those former employees and whistleblowers that talk to John, the journalist, including Tyler Schultz, who is the grandson of investor George Schultz, and a lab associate by the name of Erica Chung, including, sending lawyers after them, lawsuits, etc., etc. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, which is sort of a federal body responsible for regulating medical labs in the US, begins investigating Theranos once those stories come out. After inspections, random inspections where the people show up to test the machines, Theranos is sanctioned and Holmes and Balwani are banned from owning or operating a lab for 2 years. Just to go back a bit, CMS does proficiency testing. So if you're a lab, they'll send you random samples from their stock, and you're supposed to use whatever default method you use for all your samples to test these particular samples from CMS. And you're supposed to email them or mail them back the results of your tests. And if they match what CMS knows in the sample, because, they made the sample, so they want to see if you're accurate. If they match, then they give you a certification. And if they don't match, then, it's concerning and, they'll do more inspections. Theranos' workaround around that was Sunny Balwani bullying and yelling at his employees and forcing them to use the big Siemens AG devices to test the CMS samples instead of the Edison machines that they claim can run 200 tests.
And then I assume they would send it in saying the Edison machine tested it.
Yes, pretty much, yeah.
Theranos basically fumbled the ball at every step because every time there was an opportunity to create new laboratory technology or put their employees to use, like during the Zika virus epidemic, they would try to get clearance for these and then fuck it up. So it's possible if they would have just set the bar lower and tried to make blood tests, like using their laboratory equipment to make COVID-19 tests, not that they are around now, but hypothetically, they would have been fine.
Yeah, they've had so many chances to, I don't want to say redeem themselves because it's well beyond redemption at this point, but maybe salvage something. And every time they just sank deeper and deeper into the grave they were digging for themselves.
Right, they had significant investment. They could have just shot a little bit lower and tried to make new laboratory tests with the equipment they had and the personnel they had, which sounds like they had great scientists working for them.
Yeah. Oh, speaking of which, I wanted to mention this as an aside. During her rise, Elizabeth Holmes poached a Cambridge PhD biochemist named Ian Gibbons as one of her employees, like the head of research or whatever. He helped her design 19 different patents, which was with his name and her name on them, regarding their devices that she's supposed to develop. In 2013, Ian Gibbons commits suicide the night before he's supposed to testify in a court case where there was someone who was basically contending with Theranos that the patents they had were not necessarily new technology, but just existing technology. And Ian Gibbons was a good man who was going to testify for the truth, but he was being bullied by Holmes and Theranos so much that he took to drinking heavily. The night before he was due to testify, and he was a biochemist, so he knew exactly what to do. He took some medication and washed it down with alcohol and killed himself.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so it is not unreasonable to say that Elizabeth Holmes has blood on her hands.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, jeez.
Yeah. And, once this expose is published, Holmes issues denials. She calls the Wall Street Journal a tabloid, which, I hate the Wall Street Journal as much as any communist does, but it's not
really not a tabloid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And she threatens to sue them, and, she's yelling at everyone, and, the dominoes are falling at this point. And in 2016, after the whole debacle with CMS and, the sanctions, She breaks up with and fires Sunny Balwani. And wouldn't you know it, Erin, but she says that she broke up with him and fired him. He says that he left of his own accord and retired.
Right. Yeah.
Just two awful people, two thoroughly unpleasant characters, and I don't even know who to root for at this point, or who to root against, really.
Oh, to be a fly on the wall.
Oh, yeah. Just to emphasize how awful Sunny Balwani is, like how unpleasant he is, he's a venture capitalist, so he's a millionaire. And he decides to flash his wealth by driving, luxury cars around. And his cars have vanity plates. So his Lamborghini Gallardo, a black Lamborghini Gallardo, has a vanity plate DZKPTL. Das Kapital.
Ew, no!
Yeah, he's that kind of guy.
We're the only ones allowed to do shit like that.
But again, also, Silicon Valley psychopathy. Just remove all the vowels from a word just to make it stick or something.
At least our pun is good.
Yeah, also our pun is, relevant to the work we're doing. He's just making fun of Marx and Capital because, he's a venture capitalist who makes millions being a parasite.
Ew.
Yeah. He's also, apparently from the research I've read, he has no biochemistry or engineering or anything knowledge. So there were meetings where, the engineers would use a term to describe something, and he'd just latch onto that term and repeat it to sound smart, which is the most hilarious thing I could think of, honestly. In 2016, also after the breakup, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, begins investigating Theranos and both Balwani and Holmes for fraud. And at this point, everything is collapsing. By 2017, all these investors are suing Theranos and Holmes to the point where by 2018, Theranos is down to about 24 employees from their peak at over 700. And as all things must end, as all good things must end, on September 4th, 2018, Theranos shuts down, dissolves completely.
I'm playing a sad song for it now.
The world's smallest violin, I imagine. As far as the future goes, Holmes and Balwani were supposed to be tried this year in fall, but because of COVID, their trial's been postponed to 2021. And now Holmes is apparently married to Billy Evans, who's the heir to the Evans Hotel Group. So I guess you could still fall up anyways in Silicon Valley. How do you get a rich man after you've grifted everyone? After you've basically scammed everyone for their money, and this guy's like, yep, I'm gonna marry her.
I mean, that sounds like the worst thing to me, but gotta buy some more black turtlenecks, I guess.
Yeah, more black turtlenecks, more black pants, more black blazers, and make your eyes bulge out a bit more, very, very, out of your skull.
Maybe I'll do some Elizabeth Holmes makeup and post a photo on the Instagram at Das Criminal Pod.
Yeah, do it. I fully support that. Okay, so this case brings up a lot of issues for me. First of all, I mentioned this earlier, but the problem with US healthcare and it being, as all the patients interviewed described, the issue was one of cost. So the issue is privatization and not, fearing needles or, the amount of blood taken from you or whatever. If you nationalize the healthcare sector or at least offer a single payer system, that should just solve most patients' concerns about lab tests being expensive.
I'd also point out that private pharmaceutical companies are racing to make a coronavirus vaccine right now. Do you trust them to do everything safely? Are they motivated by trying to help us get a new disease under control or by profit?
Yeah, exactly. And especially in the US where, whichever pharmaceutical company finds a vaccine first, it gets all the good contracts from the government and all the money. So do you trust them? I don't know. I'm not anti-vaccine, but I'm also anti-capitalist. So it's a fine line.
Oh, I trust vaccines. I don't necessarily trust private pharmaceutical companies who are known to cut corners.
Yeah, no, exactly. Completely. And the other issue this podcast brought up for me is Silicon Valley being just a dystopia, a hellish dystopia of grift and scams and fraud, and money is meaningless, and it's just numbers on a fucking screen. So Theranos was worth $9 billion, and then within a year, it was worth 0. It's just numbers go up and down on a fucking screen. And as far as I'm concerned, just either send a bunch of warplanes and carpet bomb it like Dresden, or put up walls around it and just let them fucking fight each other for resources.
I have a hard time feeling bad for the victims of this fraud. Aside from those people who were given incorrect medical information through faulty tests, like obviously they are victims. And then possible investors whose like retirement money may have been in mutual funds with stock in Theranos, but that's kind of a different thing than like the DeVos family being on the board. It seems like most of these big name investors had no medical experience to know that the blood tests wouldn't work, as Holmes Stanford professors had already warned, but they saw an opportunity to get rich off people with diabetes, cancer, hypochondria, and I have a hard time feeling bad for them.
Yeah, same here. Like, for the people whose retirements got tied up in this, I sympathize and I wish they would find better. But for people like the DeVos family or the Walmart family, the Waltons, or fucking Tom Kraft of the New England Patriots, all these freaks who invested in this, sucks to be you. Maybe go to university, study some chemistry, study some biology, and don't be a parasite profiting off people's illnesses.
I do wonder as well how much of this story is just about a little bit of a cultural fascination with Elizabeth Holmes, with the woman grifter especially. I feel like if she were a man, this would be a story of a company that was fraudulent, which has happened many times in the past, by the way, like companies inflating their value, things like that. But there's a particular obsession with her as a person, with pathologizing her, with hating her, with seeing her as a certain type of demon. I'm not sure how to really put it into words, but there is something there.
No, absolutely, you're right. I mean, we began this episode by describing Holmes, and, she's the daughter of one of the guys who did Enron, basically, and Enron was a huge scam. But her father, we didn't even know his name until we researched this episode. So clearly there's something there about men in charge of companies doing scams are never identified as such. It's always the companies, always the Enron scandal. But with Theranos and her being this, and I want to say not just a woman, but a young woman, a youngish woman at least, there's definitely something there about the demon woman stealing people's money or whatever.
Right. And I'm not saying there is a narrative where she seduced Balvani into giving her that money. It sounds to me the other way around, like he's the groomer creep and she was 18 years old and maybe had these definitely bizarre dreams of being a billionaire and even fooling people, lying to people to get there. But he is not pathologized the same way she is. When it seems to me, honestly, like he's the bigger creep.
Oh yeah, for my opinion, they're both sickos for different reasons. And speaking of which, apparently, according to the research I did for this episode, Elizabeth Holmes' lawyers are planning to use the insanity defense in her trial. Not insanity as such, but like they're going to use her mental health as a basis for her defense.
Oh God, we talk about this every episode, but like mental illness doesn't cause you to be violent. It doesn't cause you to lie about being the head of a $1 billion blood company that doesn't work.
Yeah, fuck. Like, but I'm really curious to see if this defense holds up in court. I'm really excited for the trial next year.
Yeah, me too. We will keep our listeners updated.
Yeah, absolutely. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to rate us on Apple Podcasts, drop your reviews, follow us on Instagram at DasCriminalPod, and check us out on Patreon for bonus episodes, one of which will be dropped this week at patreon.com/DasCriminal.
The one coming out this week is going to be an absolute bummer, so get your liquor ready.
Yeah, this is weird because this would be a palate cleanser before, you eat shit, basically. So, we're doing this in
Before
reverse.
you eat shit.
No, I'm like metaphorically. We're not like, yeah, but...
Yeah, come over on to our Patreon where we're going to shovel shit into your mouth.
You know what I mean. It is a bummer. I was researching for that other episode too, and it's a fucking depressing one. So, yeah, this is the palate cleanser. This is dessert before the main meal.
Yeah, open up, guys.
Yeah. Without further ado, bye everyone.
Bye.